Okay, Year 8, last lesson for equations. In this video, we're going to look at quadratic equations. So everything we've learnt so far has been to do with linear equations. We've reviewed one-step and two-step equations. Then we've learnt pronumerals on both sides, harder equations with fractions and brackets, word problems, and then equations resulting from formulas. So as I said, all of the equations we've learnt so far have been linear equations, and linear means straight line. All linear equations can be represented by a straight line graph, like this one. Now the way to recognize linear equations is that they will have only powers of 1 on their pronumerals. Like this one, 2x minus 1 equals 7 is a linear equation. We can tell because this is an x to the power of 1. A quadratic equation is not linear. It's a curved line in the shape of a parabola, like this. It will have an x squared term, like 2x squared minus 1 is equal to 5. Now here's the thing. It might have 0, 1, or 2 solutions. We can see these on these graphs here. So it's where it cuts the x-axis. So this one's got 2 solutions, this one's got 1, and this one never cuts. Now how do we solve a quadratic equation? Here I've got x squared is equal to 25. When we're solving any equation, we want to get x by itself. So how do I do that? We'll use opposite operations. So remember, plus and minus are opposite operations, and so are times and divide. We also call them inverse operations. And guess what? Square and square root are also opposite operations. Now the way to tell whether we've got opposite operations is to take a number, do one of the operations to it, then do the opposite operation and see whether you end up back where you started. So let's take the number 2. We're going to square it. That gives us 4. Then I'm going to take that number 4 and do the square root, and we end up back at 2. So they are opposites. So let's have a look at how we do this. Now remember I mentioned that quadratic equations can have 0, 1, or 2 solutions. So we're going to start with the ones that have 1 solution. So that's x squared is equal to 0. So we'll start by writing that down. Now we want to get x by itself. We want to move this squared here. And the opposite of that is the square root. So we can start by doing the square root of both sides like this. And that will cancel out. So I end up with x is equal to the square root of 0, which is 0. So there's the answer. Let's move on to quadratic equations with 2 solutions. So quadratic equations where x squared is equal to a positive number will have 2 solutions, like this one. X squared is equal to 9. So remember, we want to take the squared over the other side, and it's going to become square root. What is the square root of 9? What does that mean? Well, remember it means what number multiplied by itself equals 9, which is 3, isn't it? Or minus 3. What? Well, remember 3 times 3 is equal to 9, but negative 3 times negative 3 is also equal to 9. So we have 2 answers. Now we can write it like this, or a really short way to write it is to write the plus and the minus lined up like this. This is how we read this, plus or minus 3. Is that always true? Let's check these out. Square root of 25. Well, that's 5, isn't it? But does negative 5 also work? Negative 5 times negative 5 is positive 25. It does. What about the square root of 16? That's 4, isn't it? What about negative 4? Negative 4 times negative 4 is positive 16, so yes. And then finally, square root of 100 is 10 or negative 10. So it works for any number greater than 0. And lastly, let's look at quadratic equations that don't have a solution. So a quadratic equation where x squared is equal to a negative number have no solutions, like this one. So remember, we've got to take the squared over the other side, becomes square root, and we need to find the square root of negative 1. So what number multiplied by itself equals negative 1? It's not positive 1. It's not negative 1. We just learnt that. Negative 1 times negative 1 is positive 1. The closest we'd get would be negative 1 times positive 1. But those numbers aren't the same. Even if we put it in the calculator and press equals, we get math error. There is no solution. Is that always true? Let's check these out. Square root of negative 25. Put it in the calculator. Math error. No solution. Same with square root of negative 16. No solution. Square root of negative 100. No solution. In fact, there are no solutions for any number less than 0. These numbers are actually called imaginary numbers. So in summary, if we've got a quadratic equation, x squared equals some number, and the number is negative, there'll be no solution. If it's 0, there'll be one solution. If it's positive, there'll be two solutions. So let's see if we can put this all together. Solve the quadratic equation x squared is equal to 36. Let's take the square over the other side, becomes square root. What's the square root of 36? It's 6, isn't it? But because this is positive, there's two answers, so it can be positive 6 or negative 6. How about this one? X squared is equal to 17. Same method, take the square over, becomes the square root. But the problem we have here is that this is not a whole number, it's a decimal. So we've got two options. We can either write it in exact form. We still have to put plus or minus because there's still two answers. 17 is a positive number. Or we can put it in the calculator and we can approximate it to two decimal places. Okay, we're going to finish off by looking at a couple of two-step quadratic equations. Here's the first one, 2x squared is equal to 0. So we've got to move this 2 that's out the front and also this squared. The 2 is most by itself, so let's do it first. This is a times by 2. It comes over as a divide by 2. But 0 divided by 2 is 0. So when we rewrite it, we get x squared is equal to 0. Then I want to take this squared over. It becomes square root. And the square root of 0, of course, is 0. So we've only got one solution. There it is. Here's another one, x squared plus 4 equals 0. I need to move this positive 4, and then we're going to do the square root. So move the positive 4 over, it becomes negative 4. Rewrite it, x squared is equal to negative 4. Now take our squared over, becomes square root. X is equal to the square root of negative 4, which doesn't exist. No solution. And finally, x minus 1 all squared is equal to 9. Now we're going to have to move this squared first because it's on the outside. This minus 1 is tied up with the x. Opposite of squared is square root. Let's rewrite it. X minus 1 equals 3 or negative 3. Okay, make sure that makes sense to you. We could have written this as plus or minus 3, but what I'm going to do now is separate it out into two parts. X minus 1 is equal to plus 3, and x minus 1 is equal to negative 3. All right, let's solve this one. That's a nice easy one, isn't it? We're just going to take the minus 1 over, becomes a plus 1, x is equal to 4. And then finally, let's solve this. Take the minus 1 over. Minus 3 plus 1 is minus 2. So we've got two answers here. X can either equal 4 or negative 2. Now that was a bit harder, that one, and if you don't really understand that, that's okay. All right, that brings us to the end of the topic. Now if you want to go further in equations, you would be up to Year 9 work.